Hello, welcome to this month's edition of the Seekers Forum. Today we're going to be continuing our journey into the essential steps on the Seeker's Path, which is our subject for 2017. Now, we began by looking at the gift of longing and why it's so very important to honor and stoke the flame of discontent, the sacred yearning that gets us started on the spiritual path in the first place. Next, we looked at finding our tribe and the role of community in spiritual awakening, and why it's so valuable to align with a group of like-minded souls, either in person or online, as we're doing here in the Seekers Forum, who can support and encourage us as we meet the inevitable challenges and pitfalls that come in spiritual life and practice. This month, we're going to be talking about the art of self-inquiry, and the value of asking what I call the questions that matter, regardless of the tradition that we find ourselves in. Now, why is it so critical to learn and practice the art of self-inquiry? Because asking existential philosophical questions is not something that we are taught to do, either during our formal education or by most organized religions. Instead of beginning our education with an honest inquiry into who we are as human beings, what these bodies, minds, and spirits are made of, and what is real and what is not, questioning, investigating, probing our own existence, we're taught skills that have to do with material success and obeying the rules of society. When it comes to the spiritual dimension of life, the majority of us are encouraged to have faith in our holy books, but not to turn the mirror on ourselves. We're taught to be believers instead of students of life, followers instead of seekers of truth. This passive approach often leads us to skip a crucial step in the personal spiritual journey, the tool of inquiring directly into our own deep experience in order to discover who and what we actually are. Now, it's easy to blame this passivity on our institutions, of course, which are more than happy to have an acquiescent, unquestioning flock at their disposal, as opposed to a group of free-thinking individuals who challenge their authority. But the responsibility and opportunity of self-inquiry is ours alone. Long before theologies were invented, our early ancestors gazed at the sky and asked, "Who are we in this great expanse? What is our significance? Of what are we made? Where did we come from? And where are we going? What are we meant to do while we are here? And what is there that we do not see?" This last inquiry into the unseen world, the spiritual dimension that we intuit without being able to prove, has driven our species since the dawn of time. Self-inquiry is part of what makes us human as Homo sapiens, the man of wisdom, the only creature that asks questions and investigates its own mysteries, as well as tolerates uncertainty in the quest to understand ourselves. That's why the question, "Who am I?" lies at the center of most philosophical systems. Self-knowledge is the prerequisite to wisdom and awakening, though various traditions articulate this truth in different ways, of course, from the Oracle of Delphi saying, "Know thyself," to the Buddhist path of self-knowledge through Dharma practices such as meditation. The question, "Who am I?" finds its purest iteration, perhaps, in the non-dual tradition known in the East as Advaita, Advaita, as exemplified in the teachings of such great spiritual masters as Ramana Maharshi in the early 20th century. Now, Ramana Maharshi is worth looking at as an exemplar of what can happen when we take self-inquiry as far as it can go. Ramana Maharshi put the question, "Who am I?" at the center of his teachings on self-liberation. When he was 15 years old, in fact, Ramana Maharshi had an experience that changed his life using this elemental question, "Who am I?" And I'd like to relate that story to you now just to give you a sense of what's possible through the power of self-inquiry. This is how Ramana Maharshi described his own awakening many years after the fact. He said, "I was sitting in a room on the first floor of my uncle's house. I seldom had any sickness, and on that day there was nothing wrong with my health. But a sudden violent fear of death overtook me. There was nothing in my state of health to account for it. I just felt I am going to die and began thinking what to do about it. It did not occur to me to consult a doctor or my elders or friends. I felt that I had to solve the problem myself then and there. And this is how Ramana Maharshi goes on. He says, "The shock of the fear of death drove my mind inwards, and I said to myself mentally, without actually framing the words, 'Now death has come, what does it mean? What is it that is dying? This body dies.' And I at once dramatized the occurrence of death. I lay with my limbs stretched out stiff as though rigor mortis had set in, and imitated a corpse so as to give greater reality to the inquiry. I held my breath and kept my lips tightly closed so that no sound could escape, so that neither the word I or any other word could be uttered. 'Well, then,' I said to myself, 'this body is dead. It will be carried stiff to the burning ground and there burned and reduced to ashes. But with the death of this body, am I dead? Is the body I? It is silent and inert, yet I feel the full force of my personality and even the voice of the I within me, apart from it. So,' he went on, 'I am spirit transcending the body. The body dies, but the spirit that transcends it cannot be touched by death. This means I am the deathless spirit.' All of this was not dull thought. It flashed through me vividly as living truth, which I perceived directly, almost without any thought process. I was something very real, the only real thing about my present state, and all the conscious activity connected with my body was centered on that I." He continues, "From that moment onward, the I, or self, capital S, focused attention on itself by a powerful fascination. Fear of death had vanished once and for all. Absorption in the self continued unbroken from that time on. Other thoughts might come and go like the various notes of music, but the I continued like the fundamental Suruti note that underlies and blends with all the other notes. Whether the body was engaged in talking, reading, or anything else, I was still centered on I." Isn't that wonderful? And that is what self-inquiry on the level of a saint looks like. It isn't a parlor game or a casual investigation. It's a matter of life or death. In the book, The Perennial Philosophy, Aldous Huxley puts this very succinctly. He wrote, quote, "A saint is one who knows that every moment of our human life is a moment of crisis. For at every moment we are called upon to make an all-important decision, to choose between the way that leads to death and spiritual darkness and the way that leads toward light and life." Let me just read that again. Aldous Huxley wrote, "A saint is one who knows that every moment of our human life is a moment of crisis. For at every moment we're called upon to make an all-important decision, to choose between the way that leads to death and spiritual darkness and the way that leads toward light and life." Self-inquiry is the choice of light over darkness and lies at the heart of the seeker's path, whatever language or tradition you use to describe that path. As you come to know yourself, you become increasingly freer and more peaceful, surveying yourself from head to toe, inside and out, with questions that are intended to wake you up and to wipe the dust of ignorance from your eyes. Now, all of us are not Ramana Maharshi. We're not going to be locking ourselves in rooms and practicing rigor mortis till our lips turn blue and our toes curl up. But we can ask ourselves liberating questions on a regular basis. We can question our stories, our beliefs, our disingenuousness. We can inquire into the nature of God and how that power inhabits our bodies. We can reach beyond the egoic, self-centered cage through imagination, in the sense of reaching beyond what we know, and come to inhabit a larger, more natural and energized version of ourselves. In fact, whenever I hear Shakespeare's famous line, "To thine own self be true," I interpret that to mean, to thine own self be known, to thine own self be visible, To thine own self be open to inquiry and exploration. It's that form of truth that we're going to be speaking about today. Truth as self-knowledge. So I'd like to turn our attention now to 7 essential questions that have the power to move us more deeply into this question of who am I, and how to embody that awareness and that authenticity and wisdom as we come to explore ourselves on the spiritual path. So, question number 1. Am I this body? In terms of self-inquiry, the human body is a kind of mixed blessing. On the one hand, there is no life without it, obviously. There's no seeking, there's no learning, there's no power, there's no love. Without the brain, there would be no self-knowledge. And without self-knowledge, of course, there's no quality of life or spiritual growth. And yet, it is precisely this body that fosters the illusion of our separateness and disconnection from one another. These brilliant brains of ours aren't very good with paradox and subtlety. We have a lot of trouble holding apparently opposite truths in our mind at the same time. And yet, doing that is the key to wisdom, holding apparently opposite truths in our mind at the same time. Paradox lies at the heart of wisdom. And one such paradox is that although we are individuals, we are not separate. Although we're individuals, we are not separate. Believing that we are is the result of what Albert Einstein famously called a kind of optical delusion. This is how the father of relativity put it. Einstein said, quote, "A human being is a part of the whole called by us universe, a part limited in time and space. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings as something separated from the rest, a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty." Isn't that wonderful? And when considering this question of the body, his observation is especially helpful. We do suffer from a kind of optical delusion. Just notice how your physical eye delineates the world into 2 spheres. You, meaning your physical self, and the rest of creation. This delusion rests on the visual proof, quote unquote, that who you are stops at the boundaries of your skin. But just take a moment to sit with that assumption and inquire into how true it actually is, considering everything that we know today about quantum physics, for example, and the fact that nothing is as solid as it seems. In fact, material life is based upon a constant exchange of elements and energy between your inner and outer worlds. Once you've made headway on the illusion of physical separateness, you can move on to asking yourself, what about you as a personal identity is not contained in this flesh and blood casing? What about you is not contained in this physical body? Just think about it. Your wisdom, your passion, your empathy, your imagination, the soul of you that reaches out into the world and transcends the physical structure. What do these aspects of who you are have to do with the physical body, if anything? Just try sitting with this question and noticing what arises. Moving on to question number 2. How can I end the war in my mind? If we hope to explore this question, it's necessary to inquire into the nature of mind itself, of course, and what this thing is that we call mind. What's it made of? When we do this, we notice that what we call mind is actually thinking or cogitation. It is thinking that causes the movements that we label mental. Also, the brain and the mind are not the same thing. You could compare the relationship between the two to that of a battery to electricity. The power of electricity transcends the physical battery, just as the mind transcends this 3-pound organ between our ears. And yet, the paradox is that there is no human mind without a brain. In the practice of self-inquiry, the more we understand about the nature of mind and how it relies upon but transcends the physical brain, the better equipped we are to become its ally. Remember, a couple of months back, Mark Coleman, the meditation teacher, spoke to the Seekers Forum about how to become the ally of our own minds. The more we learn to observe the mind and its thinking, the more skillful we become at not getting trapped by our thoughts or mistaking them for who we are. If our thoughts were the limits of who we are, we would not be able to observe them. If we can watch our thoughts, then it stands to reason that we are not our thoughts, since whatever can be observed is not, by definition, who we are. We come to know that who we are essentially is the observer, the witness, the unchanging awareness that enables us to have perceptions. And knowing this is a great liberation, because it frees us from the prison of me and the awful idea that who we are is nothing but this mass of compulsions and worries and emotions and mental chatter. The more we sit with this question and test these observations for ourselves, the more balanced and peaceful we can become in the midst of thinking. In other words, we can use the mind without imagining that we are nothing more than this mind. This brings us to question number 3. What is contained in my shadow? By now, most of you in the Seekers Forum are well aware of what is meant by the shadow, which is Carl Jung's description of this off-limits zone that we maintain in the psyche in order to hold our idea of self together and avoid whatever threatens us or causes pain in the form of shame, guilt, fear, and uncertainty. More than anything, the egoic self, this little me, wants to be sure of its own boundaries. And it does this by declaring and demarcating from a very early age what it is not. You've heard of the terrible twos, when little kids run around saying no to everything, stomping their feet, refusing, resisting. This time of the terrible twos is a watershed moment of individuation for the child, when each no to what it doesn't want is a yes to what it does want, not only externally, but in the process of self-creation. Wanting to be this kind of person, but not that kind of person. Wanting these results and not those results. This self-image and social status rather than that one. With each no, the child learns to suppress and eventually hide aspects of itself that bring unwelcome results or contradict the identity it wants to construct. Those unwanted aspects of the personality go into the shadow bag. Not only the so-called weaknesses and painful parts, but also our gifts, originality, passion, those parts of us that the small me may not know what to do with. Perfect examples of the gifts that we put in our shadow are suppressing creativity and desire. Creativity, by its nature, is free, and we don't always know quite where creativity will lead us. And that's what makes it so marvelous and also what makes it so threatening. So many folks suppress their creative gifts in favor of a sense of control and security, choosing tamer, more manageable paths for themselves that will unfortunately fail to satisfy their calling. And the same goes for desire, of course, whether it's the desire to outgrow what our parents want for us, create our own paths, our own mission, or the desire for, say, a same-sex partner, which many people shove into their proverbial closet to their own detriment. You can see the shadow as the kind of big closet where we hide and deceive ourselves. And it's not until we examine its contents that we begin to know ourselves in our wholeness, in the round, the dark as well as the light parts, the wild and the tame, the dangerous and the safe, the transgressive, original, and quote-unquote unacceptable, as well as the obedient and socialized. So investigating the contents of this shadow closet is a critical beginning step in the practice of self-inquiry. Moving on to question number 4. Where is desire leading me? Now, this question of desire relates to the matter of the shadow, of course, and requires that we acknowledge and examine our so-called acceptable desires as well as those that we hide, because desire is the very fuel of our being. Okay, it animates us throughout our lives. It affects not only body and mind, but also spirit, and it's critical that we honor and embrace our desires. Not in order to satisfy them necessarily, though we may choose to do that, but in order to harness the energy that desire is a container for. This is a critical point. Many people are afraid of expressing their desires for fear of becoming hedonistic. But this is to miss the point about the actual value of desire, which comes not from pursuing every wish and whim, but from harnessing the energy that desire is a container for. Let me just repeat that, please. The value of desire comes not from pursuing every wish and every whim, but from harnessing the energy that desire is a container for. If Dante hadn't acknowledged his desire for a married woman, we would have no Beatrice in the Divine Comedy. He didn't need to actually consummate that desire. That was completely secondary. What he needed was to allow himself to feel the power of his desire in order to create something beautiful from it and communicate that to others. It's less the object of desire than the impetus of desire that concerns us on the spiritual path and helps us to understand our individual nature. Very often, the why behind desire is far more important than the how to attain it, since the impulse of desire itself is often fleeting and immaterial. But the energy underneath it is animating and potentially very constructive on the path of self-knowledge. This takes us to question number 5. What is the difference between the real and the true? That's a critical distinction. For example, when you go to a sad movie and dissolve in tears, the emotions are absolutely real. You are weeping, you need a tissue, your heart takes on that poignant glow, you feel the effects of crying and sadness and swollen eyes. But the cause of your sadness, this tear-jerking film, is not true. It's a fictional story impersonated by actors in a completely artificial dramatic setup using a variety of faking techniques, taped, edited, and then projected onto a screen. Nothing about this film is true in any lasting sense of the word, and yet it produced a response that is real. And this is where we become confused, mistaking what feels real for the actual truth. There's a cliche about this, that feelings aren't facts, and that's what it points to, the same thing. Being ephemeral, emotions are never the ultimate truth, in fact. They may guide us in truthful, authentic ways. They may point us to deep truths within ourselves and awaken us to spiritual reality. But nothing that arises and passes away is the truth, since the truth, by definition, is unchanging, eternal, and constant, beyond the movements of time and form. So ask yourself, where are you confusing what feels real with what is actually true? This is a very effective line of inquiry. So this takes us to question number 6. Who is afraid? You could replace that with any number of emotions, but I've chosen fear because it's the source of so much confusion between the experience, fear, and the experiencer, the self-idea or personality. We tend to use these two interchangeably, in fact. Instead of the awkward "I'm feeling fear," we jump to "I am afraid." And this dissolving of the gap between emotion and identity, this merging of the feeling with the feeler, strengthens our false sense of self and our confusion between what we feel and who we are. Because in truth, these two are not the same thing. I am not my fear. I am not my worry. I am not whatever the emotion might be. The more we challenge our fears, the smaller and less entangled with personal identity they become. Fear comes and goes, but the self remains. And you can try this for yourself by making a list of your fears and then challenging yourself by asking, does this particular fear contain me? Is this all of who I am? Is this fear constant? When and how does it arise in me? What is my story about this fear? The more you do this, the more obvious the answer will become, that who you are is not afraid, since the self is always and forever free. And this takes us to our final question, which the 13th century German theologian and mystic Meister Eckhart put so memorably. Meister Eckhart asked, "Is the eye through which I see God the same eye through which God sees me? Is the eye through which I see God the same eye through which God sees me?" In other words, is there a separation between me and God, or are we in essence one and the same? Does the consciousness that fills one also fill the other? Are we, in fact, God observing itself through human eyes? Of all these questions we're talking about today, this one is the most transcendent and the least amenable to a factual answer, because the truth it communicates is closer to poetry than to prose, just as the koans employed by Zen masters are used to tease the mind beyond its rational limits and point to the unseen world of the metaphysical. So just allow this question to rest in your mind and notice your own internal response. Sense what arises in you as you reflect on Meister Eckhart's words. Is the eye through which I see God the same eye through which God sees me? And recognize that this response in you is coming from a source beyond your mind. It's coming from the very source of what we call the eternal, whether or not you believe in God. This is such an enriching and valuable question, and I recommend that you use it often as an object of reflection and meditation. So just to recap these 7 questions of self-inquiry. Number 1, am I this body? Number 2, how can I end the war in my mind? Number 3, what is contained in my shadow? Number 4, where is desire leading me? Number 5, what is the difference between the real and the true? Number 6, who is afraid? And finally, number 7, is the eye through which I see God the same eye through which God sees me? These are fantastic lines of self-inquiry, and I hope that you will use them to deepen your spiritual awareness. I've been doing it for many years, and I can tell you that the fruits of insight are tremendous. So that's what I wanted to say to you today about the power of self-inquiry, and I'll speak to you again next month. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.